Howdy, folks. So this is a video that I wanted to walk through that is not necessarily specific to our course, but because we are going to be working in fiction, I thought that it would be worth sharing a few things that I think are these fundamental ways that we consider how we approach writing a piece of fiction. Some of you may be working in short or long form, depending on your preferences. Um, and especially since we're going to be reading both a long form novel as well as a number of short stories, I do think it's worth just laying some groundwork things to think about as it relates to how you as a writer engage with both your craft and the craft of others when looking at those as examples. Now, this is going to be relatively surface because this idea of these three layers of fiction that I'm going to talk about could be the subject of an entire course all on their own. But this is really just to give you some things to think about in the back of your mind as you are both writing in this class and reading our model texts. So let's talk about what it is that I mean when I talk about what I think of as writing's three layers. So sort of broad scope here. First, there is the layer of what kind of story I'm writing. Then there's also what are the craft elements that I should be utilizing. And then there's what are the sentence level concerns I should have in mind. And you can think of this way. This is kind of the big foundation. You know, you have to think about what you are writing, the kind of story you're writing at the macro level. And then the sentence level concerns are sort of the microscopic pieces that make up any piece of writing. And the craft elements are kind of in between and speak to both of these. Okay. So again, I'm going to kind of go through each of these relatively quickly because this whole thing could be an entire course. So when I talk about what kind of thing you're writing in story form, what I'm talking about is you do want to have in mind and think about what form of fiction you're writing, because each one has its own particular concerns and structures. So what I mean here is that there is a difference when you are reading and writing material. There are different things about whether you are engaging with micro or flash fiction, more short story versus that nebulous thing called a novella versus a novel, or even really a novel that is part of a series. Right? Each of these forms has its own particular concerns and ways that we engage them and experience them as readers and writers differently. So, for example, in short story, you certainly can't digress nearly as much, go into quite as much detail, have as many characters as you do in a novel. Similarly, short stories often do not wrap up every single potential thread. They don't necessarily offer significant resolution, although you can certainly make an argument that novels, especially novels in book series, don't individually do that either. So without getting too much into the weeds of those, that's what's important to think about is what am I writing and how do I need to, or what am I reading and how do I need to recalibrate both my understanding as a reader and my understanding as a writer of what I'm doing based on which of those forms I'm engaged with. And just a couple other things I'd say, I mentioned this. So the issues here include principles of selection. So like what can you include? What can you leave out? The notion of scene versus summary. And this is something that one of our techniques in 2 videos we'll get into. In a short story, you may have to summarize a little bit more than you would in a novel. You can have a lot more sprawling scenery, actual narrative moments in a novel. You certainly need to have them in a short story, but you are probably going to have to summarize a little bit more. And like I said, you might be able to have far more threads or elements of a plot in something longer than in something shorter. Okay. So that's always worth keeping in mind. So then the middle level, again, the one that I think speaks between the two is what I call craft elements. And like I said, these are generally the things that the techniques in 2 videos that you're going to see throughout our course are talking about. So I'm not going to talk about each of the individual ones too much here, but these are the fundamental elements of craft that all writers hopefully have in mind and use when they are telling a story. So these include, and there are many other ways to conceive of these. I want to give a slight citation here to the writer and teacher Janet Burroway. I have completely stolen this list of 5 things from her book, Imaginative Writing, The Elements of Craft, which was the very first creative writing textbook I ever had. too long ago when I took my first intro to creative writing class, but it is a way that I have conceived of the components of writing in a way that I think has helped me a lot, which is why I share it. So these, and again, you're going to see these in our techniques in 2 videos. There's a reason that each of these in some way pops up in there. But these are things like image, voice, character, setting, and story. And again, I don't want to spend a whole lot of time just defining each of these here because that would take so long. But just thinking about, what are the things that we have in mind from a crafting perspective when we are writing what we are writing? What are the things that we are trying to think about? So I'll just give quick examples like, what textural details am I giving to elicit sensory specificity? That's image. How am I thinking about who my characters are, what they want, what drives them? That's character. What is the plot? What is the external stuff that's happening? But also, why are these incidents important to the characters? Why am I sharing these moments from their lives? That's story. Okay. So then with sentence level concerns, this is where we are thinking about how we construct what I already called those micro level building blocks of all writing, the sentences that we use to create the bigger story, the sentences that carry the craft techniques from that middle level. And so this is going to include a whole lot of stuff. This is going to be things like syntax. How are you actually constructing the grammar of your sentences? Simple sentences, complex sentences, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Semantics, the meanings of the words that you choose in terms of denotations, connotations. What are the actual definitions of those words? What are the sort of emotional weight that a particular word carries in terms of beyond its definitional meaning? The level of specificity that you use, the lexicon, your actual vocabulary, the varying lengths of your sentences, acoustics, how sentences sound. As just an included word of advice here, if you are not in the habit of doing it now, you should add at some point in your process of writing something, reading your own work out loud. That's how you hear what it is that you've written. That's what we mean by the acoustics of the words that you've put on the page. I could even add things like choices of repetitions, how you're choosing, this is perhaps a silly one, but character proper names versus when to use pronouns, right? Things like that. But these are all those vocabulary things and sentence level things that we do that lead back to those other things. And this really is the core of our style and our authorial voice. These are the tiny things. They add up to the craft things, which all add up to the larger thing. Okay. So the reason I share all this is these are the things that I think you want to be paying attention to, both in your own writing, but also in your reading of the model text that we're reading. So, why does a thing work either as a novel length project or as a short story? Keeping in mind that a short story is going to be able to include and accomplish very different things from a novel. How are those various craft techniques of